Stephen, thank you very much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since a friend made me aware of your work and looking at a number of the inquiries that you've held, I'm really intrigued to see where this conversation goes today.
Likewise, and I'm curious now, Mark, who's that mutual friend? Yeah, so I'm glad that somebody mentioned my work, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Wonderful. So, as you are aware, we jump straight in, and it is with the question of, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Hmm. Probably, and it's not because it's the title of your podcast, Mark, but I've always wrestled with the question, what is a good life? And what does that mean for me? So initially, when I was younger, I thought that meant following a vocation, and I studied for the priesthood actually with an Irish order called the French order called the Vincentians, but in an Irish province. So I was 18 years old, but I lived in a community of fathers, sisters, or daughters of charity, and I was a volunteer. And it was an attempt to discover, how can I follow a vocation beyond a traditional job. And it was a very important year. Even though I didn't become a priest, I spent 1 year doing youth work, 1 year working in an Alzheimer's disease unit, a second year working in a homeless shelter underground in Westminster, and then teaching in an East End school in Glasgow, a deaf centre, a mental prison. So hugely formative, but helping me inquire, what is it to live a good life? For me, it wasn't to follow that path of vocation, but it did set me on that kind of thinking of questioning what gives my life meaning, what gives it contribution or service, and what brings aliveness. So those were the kind of three threads that I was reflecting on as I've come to inquire it more into that journey.
Wow, you're I think the fourth or the fifth person that has studied to be a priest or
Yeah.
contemplated. And I think I said it the last time this
Yes.
occurred. I must actually interview a priest at some stage because you're in good company. Another
No,
author, Thomas Moore,
I was
who wrote
listening to
Care of the
your
Soul.
podcast. Right.
I interviewed him, and he mentioned he was trying to be a priest at one point. Another
Oh,
friend of mine.
goodness. I listened to
Um,
your podcast with Neil Donald Walsh,
yeah,
and he also trained initially or thought of training.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
there's a
it's
common thread here
but isn't
in
that
following the vocation.
Yeah, but isn't that what a beautiful grounding it sounds though that it still afforded you just with the sheer variety of
Mm.
places that it put you in contact with.
Yeah, I think that's right. Also, living in community, so it's not an individualistic affair, but I had to live with, five or six other young people to learn what is it to live together, what is it to work together, to pray together, to think together. So some reflect together. So some sense of uh, understanding the meaning of community rather than just your individual good life. And also, you're right, being exposed to a variety of people in different contexts, particularly those who may not be in those who may be in the margins of society in some way. That is super useful for helping act as a way to reflect on my own life. Where do I want to live? How do I want to live? And helping engender different values. So even if I didn't follow the traditional path or go forward in that vocation, it was definitely formative. And I'd say help grounding some of the attitudes and the philosophy for how do I live life going forward.
For you, just out of interest, what was it? Was there a point or was there a moment of clarity which suggested to you that this wouldn't be something that you'd be continuing with?
Yeah, I think I had the devotion for my parents and the childhood faith. They're Catholics from Goa, very much devotional, and that did inform me, and that aspect of devotion and devotional service, and is still pretty much part of my identity. But I think for myself, I found it hard to be in an order dedicated to serving the poor when I had to study, when I had all my meals cooked, and I couldn't relate to a label or like where people would treat you differently because of a title. And there are other philosophical differences, but the main one is I read a book, and I read a couple of books at that time. One was by an existential psychotherapist called Sheldon Kopp. He wrote a book called "If You Meet Buddha on the Road, Kill Him," which was about like discovering what are almost like holy cows, what are our unquestioned beliefs, and thinking more deeply about what gives us meaning. How do we live a life of meaning? And the second contributor to questioning was actually a Jesuit priest, Anthony de Mello. I read a book called Awareness, which was more a compilation of his essays and retreats, and got me thinking more broadly outside of my Catholic identity to interreligious thoughts around. He had much on Krishnamurti, on Alan Watts, on other thinkers, and it's sort of probably gave me a bit Catholic with a big C, meaning universal. How do I make sense of my story beyond my own faith tradition and think more broadly? Now, it's not something, it's something I don't practice now, but it's something that I don't reject wholeheartedly because I think it's definitely been part of my story and has given me a useful grounding in order to move forward in my career.
Honestly, that sounds like it's just a delightful interpretation of it all, and so much seeing the value in something and a certain flexibility or your own perspective melded into it as well.
Mm.
Which I just with the mention of De Mello, I must say he's one of whether it's awareness, or there's another, I forget the title of it, but another book on love, and then there's the song of the bird, which is another
Mm.
delightful compilation of things. What was just when you mentioned him there, what was your kind of reaction to some of his work? Someone who
I
just brings
loved
a
it.
smile to my face.
I love the humor.
Yeah.
And the first book I actually read was Sadhana, which is had a picture of somebody meditating in a yogic position and somebody and a crucifix, and it was almost like how do you hold east and west on the image of the cover. But the word sadhana means practice, and it was full of spiritual practices. Like, can you sit in silence just for 10 minutes and observe what happens with your thoughts or in your body? There was a meditation on death, and I remember doing this as a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, and to like thinking, okay, what am I learning here? And I love the stories. So you mentioned the Song of the Bird, or there's 1 minute wisdom, 1 minute nonsense, and they're full of like parables or wisdom tales, let's say from Nasruddin or the Sufi tradition. And for me, they're more instructive than, let's say, nonfiction. Having stories is a way that can come to some truth. So I remember one master and a teacher, and the student is saying to the master, Master, you tell so many stories and parables, but you never reveal their meaning to us. He was very frustrated. And the master said, Yes, but how would you like it if someone offered you fruit, having chewed it first? And I think that's, it's instructive because, part of it is in our own chewing or masticating, our own chewing of life, our own wrestling with these questions that you're posing in the podcast that give it meaning, not necessarily to receive easy answers. And whenever I've written a book, I tend to avoid tips. Instead, I give questions to live with, or in the spirit of Rilke, learn to love the questions themselves, or experiments to try, so people can discover, does that work for me? If not, how can I just find my own truth rather than, the 5 tips of how to do this, which may be useful, particularly for the person prescribing them, but it may not land in the life context of the individual who receives them.
You mentioned just in terms of your kind of that grounding in the priesthood and the sentiments of, meaning, contribution, and service. You also mentioned another word of aliveness.
Mm.
Curious as you're moving through life, just the significance of that word to you in terms of what you're drawing meaning from, or what's kind of evolving for you.
Yeah, so aliveness relates to, if I was to have a goal for life, Mark, it would be aliveness. And the image I have is being, it's from Saint Irenaeus. He said the glory of God is a person who's fully alive. And what I understand by that is like a metaphor. Imagine standing naked in the rain, being able to feel sensations on every part of your body. Imagine some, and there's a sense of aliveness, not deadness, in that metaphor or that image, and that means aliveness to all of life, not just to the joy or just to the excitement, but also to the pain, to the shame, to the guilt, to the whole human experience. So for me, that is what aliveness means. It's related to being fully human and as well as fully alive, and in that capacity. So when I thought of my spirituality, it wasn't necessarily tied to religion or to church, but I grow in my spirituality by growing in my humanity, and that is the way I understand my own story, or my own inquiry, as it were. To come back to your original question, is how do I grow in my own humanity, and not separating that from my spirituality.
Um, I've had to say this on a few recent episodes, but I've been it's the same similar inquiry, similar starting point, similar ending point to the conversations. But just every so often, I just hear something just stunningly beautiful, like you've just said there. Like, I grow in my spirituality when I grow in my humanity. I
Mm.
haven't heard it put like that before, but for whatever reason, there's something deeply kind of emotionally resonant in that observation.
Yeah, I think when I, like many of us who maybe were schooled in a traditional philosophical or religious tradition, I initially went down the transpersonal path. So if you imagine the almost like vertical axis, thinking, how do I grow? How did But a part of that journey is recognizing that it's the transpersonal is in the interpersonal. So how do we bring that into everyday life rather than into something separate from life? So that was the journey, almost bringing that journey up, or the vertical into the horizontal, into everyday ordinariness, and being able to live that, so it continues that exploration or continues that journey.
That image you gave us there of just feeling the rain and
Mm,
feeling everything. Curious, just in terms of in curious of terms of your latest book, Shadows at Work.
mm.
What was the motivation for even, was it some ways tied to this, or how would you even describe the what inclination arose to explore that?
Yeah, it was very much tied to that, Mark. I think growing up as a Catholic is like a PhD in guilt and shame, but it's also like it's also like a PhD in forgiveness and compassion as well. But so you experience all of those emotions. Sorry, maybe we have to cut this. But you experience all of those emotions, not just the good and the bad, eh? And you sort of wrestle with those questions. What is it to do good? What is it to do bad? Who am I? And they become intensely personal rather than just theoretical. So, and then, when I didn't train as a priest, I left university. I was luckily sponsored by a leadership program, and it wasn't by, a consulting company. I was sponsored by the prison service. So I actually worked with young offenders in Feltham Young Offenders, which was a juvenile prison at that time, which was quite notorious. There was a lot of bullying, a lot of suicides. And I worked with boys who were 14 and 15 years old, and yet they'd been sentenced to life for murder, robbery, and rape, as well as other crimes. Some more serious offenders. And you would have a thought, are these bad, evil, or good? Is that simply? But most of the boys were not even able to shave. Most of them were illiterate. They were not able to read or write. Most of them had children already at that young age. Most of them had absent fathers. So every image that you might have of somebody who's pure evil and having murdered or absolutely was confounded, and the simplistic notions of good and bad were really challenged. In my professional career, I've worked with hundreds of organizations, thousands of executives, and the paradoxes in pariah companies that are thought of as bad, I find the most engaged cultures, the most colleagues who care, support each other. In cultures like in NGOs, or I find sometimes the most toxic cultures where people feel burnt out, exhausted, undervalued, unappreciated. And so there's a paradox there. And I've been curious, why do people derail? Why do people create, or leaders create cultures that tend to be toxic or full of shadow behavior? So on that corporate side was my interest in this. And you see public cases, let's say the CEO of Astronomer captured on a Coldplay camera, or the CEO of BP resigning. But it's also serious issues like Boeing, the Air Max disaster, where 346 people died because of a company's inability to listen to its employees rather than scapegoat them, particularly the whistleblowers, and making decisions based on profit and speed rather than safety and quality. So there's huge implications that cost lives when we don't pay attention to the shadow. And then on a societal basis, I've noticed that what some people have been calling this shift to the dark, like the phrase used by Mello and Matt Klein, is the dark mode shift, almost like a dark mode on a phone where things have gone black. And I said in the past decade, it was a light mode. We were moving towards progress in climate, let's say in global trade, but now we seem to be more disconnected, far more polarization between parties and between individuals. The experience, even if it isn't true in actuality, but the experience of more precariousness, the experience of more anxiety, and also the repealing of laws protecting climates, etc. So we seem to be going to this dark mode. And for me, the dark isn't negative. The dark is a place of transformation. Think about the baby in the womb. Think about the seed in the earth. When you think that nothing is happening, is almost always the place or the space in which transformation is happening. Yet we don't necessarily. It's not a comfortable place to be. So my work is in not knowing. You mentioned not doing, not being, and the shadow is for listeners and leaders to be able to approach the dark, confront the dark, but also to lead from the dark, not as a space to avoid, but as a resource, really, for doing things in a different way and in a much more integral way. So that's the thinking process that I've gone through.
This is, I don't know, there's something stunningly kind of accepting, I think, of the, even when you dovetail the experiences with youth and your what our preconceptions could be of a group of people. There's something almost deeply understanding, and then even just looking at even that play out in the corporate landscape, and some ideas we may have of certain companies and how it actually might be when we're in amongst it and amongst people there. I think
Mm.
there's a really lovely kind of balanced tone, or a mature, like a wise tone in just how you're, I don't know, engaging with stuff, which oftentimes people are just, and I think we talk about the polarization, one of the quickest ways I think we do that is we see something and we go, that's not me, that's that person over there,
Mm.
they're the bad person. But just the way
Mm.
you laid that out there, I don't know, there's a beautiful sense of depth to how you're looking at this. It doesn't sound very sensational, if you get me.
Yeah, I start in the new book with a story about a composer called Sir Michael Tippett, who died when he was 93 in 1989. And he was imprisoned in Wormwood Scrubs because he was a conscious objector to the war. And he wrote a libretto, a piece of music that was called "A Child of Our Time." And he wrote this, and it's quite got some very violent verses, because he talks about this period of great violence, because it was written in the time of World War II, and particularly around Kristallnacht, when there was a night of violence and destruction. And he said that political activism in a world of polarity and in a world of darkness isn't enough. That's what is needed is a much more psychological work. And he said about working with the unemployed and with young people, and offered music and the arts as a way to do that. But the line from his libretto is this. He said, "I would know my shadow and my light, then at last I shall be whole." And the point he was making is that when we don't account for our shadow, and literally we project our darkness onto others, and it ends up in scapegoating, in othering, in violence, in destruction. And a part of psychological maturity is the capacity to confront our own darkness. But often in leadership and in the world of work, that's not even an option. It's only, positive psychology, strengths based, thinking about the light. And we don't give enough room for acknowledging, accepting, integrating, working with our dark. Where I have gone beyond this in the book, you mentioned in earlier in before I think we started the conversation, you've interviewed Jungian analysts. Look, I wanted to go beyond the shadow as a Jungian concept, which is predominantly about psychology and predominantly around understanding my inner child, understanding what are the things that I have suppressed, repressed, or are unaware of that influence me in the present, which is useful. And what I love about that is Jung never spoke only about negative things. He also talked about the golden shadow, our gifts and our creativity, and that we also may be not aware of, that we can bring to light and that we can show. But I also thought, we're not just psychological beings, we're biological, we're embodied. So I wanted to apply not only the psychological lens, but a biological lens to looking at shadow. I wanted to apply a social, cultural lens, and then a spiritual lens. So all four lenses, and particularly understandable to the everyday manager or everyday leader, into how does it play out in the world of work. So that was really my inquiry into looking at my own shadow, but understanding that not just through the psychological lens, but through all of those four lenses.
Could you give me a sense then, Stephen, just for how, beyond that Jungian sense, then just how you might describe, even give a sense of the word shadow as far as you perceive it then?
Yeah, so the Jungian lens is more clearer. So it's the me that I don't see, and all the things that may have impacted you in the past that are still impacting your life in the present. So let's say you grew up in an environment where your parents were always arguing, and it was quite high conflict. As a child, it made sense maybe to withdraw, to become quiet, to remove yourself, because there's no way that you would be able to come in and to stop that conflict. But as an adult, whenever I come across conflict now, I might still have the pattern of withdrawing, not saying anything, which might be damaging to my career. So that kind of relationship to anger, relationship to power, may be in the shadow, and something that I am able to work with and to grow through. Now, the biological lens is saying that we're also influenced by our genetics, we're influenced by our cultural heritage, we're influenced by our hormones, we're influenced by chemicals, and the work of looking at the body or embodiment says, we see and interact with the world through the state of our nervous systems. So there's a huge impact on biology and shadow behavior. The evolutionary biologist Robert Sapolsky, he wrote a book called Determined and also Behave. And he talks very openly about his own struggle with depression. But he doesn't say depression is only a psychological, but he links it to elevated hormones and to chemical changes too. And they're highly correlated. So there's not this independence between biology, psychology, but they are intimately connected. I like to think of it more like a kaleidoscope rather than separate lanes. And studies done show that when our hormones are elevated and when our amygdala is hijacked, we tend to play out behavior that is considered not healthy and anti-pro-social. But interestingly, it does differ between women and men. Something interesting. There's a writer who Annabelle, I think, Streets, and she looked at women creatives or women artists, and they tended to be actually more creative at night to do their best work when their neocortex wasn't so under that control. Whereas men tended to be violent in the early hours, probably under some form of intoxication. She talks to artists like Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield, that created their best work with their night selves. So it's interesting to see the differences. But whether we look at organizations like AA, who have the acronym HALT, whether you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, there's a huge impact between the state of our physiology and biology and how shadow behavior happens. And yet we don't really attend much in organizations to protecting and encouraging healthy physiological, biological, and embodied humans and our being in that respect. This third one around culture is the we that we don't see, almost like the fish in the water. And culture has a bigger impact on shadow behavior than individual actors. So the myth is that there's the bad apple individual actor, yet the culture can shape behavior much more. So whether that's incentives that encourage bad behavior, or selfish action, whether that's hyper competition that discourages collaboration, withholding of information, or unclear goals that encourage rule breaking for profit maximization. But clearly, there's a huge impact on culture. I had a colleague, he wrote a book called Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? He used to go into companies and speak to the executives and say to them, imagine somebody new starts at your company today. I want you to throw out the induction book and tell them, what does it really take to succeed around here? And they would tell him things like, you must always leave your coat on the chair so people think you've just popped to the bathroom, but you're never out. You must always walk around as if you're super busy, otherwise, people will think you don't have enough to do. You must never say anything to Mrs. Brown on the reception that's anyway negative. Her husband's related to the CEO. There were unwritten rules that affect how do we operate. And cultures, we know that there's low psychological safety, people cannot speak truth to power, result in toxic behavior. And lastly, the spiritual lens. For me, the shadow, I didn't want it just to be seen as something that's negative. There's a whole tradition of the shadow being almost like the place of descent, like the space of transformation we talked about earlier, where St. John of the Cross talks about the dark night, that place that we go to where all our usual ways of coping with the world get broken down, and that we can attend to that place as a space of something new being built rather than carrying on with the old story. And many traditions, Taoism, they showed the light and the dark balanced, and in the light a bit of darkness. And there's a whole philosophical tradition from the mystics like Eckhart that talk about seeing the value in the darkness. So I use a lot of poetry in the book to explore what is that sense of the value in the dark, not just in the bright, and recognizing the gift that the darkness can give us if we're able to be with it and able to tolerate it. And yes, that's some of the ideas in the four lenses that I explore more fully in the book.
I adore this description of it and even just the breakdown of it and these components. I think there's something quite beautiful as well, and even just the spiritual almost flourish or finish to it. If you, I know it's not just going to be this linear fixed thing. The shadow is an evolving piece or a piece like that we live with too. But just in terms of that, I mean, just the depth of the perception that we could conceive of shadow, and that almost seems like a welcome. There's an entry point to this, or there's a welcoming to it, or there's something redeeming about this exploration. And I don't mean just in turning light or dark to light and making it like that, but just the actual lived experience of it seems so totally worthwhile or fundamental almost in the concept or the notion of a good life. Just
Mm.
was intrigued to know, like, what is it that brought you comfort in, even, I guess, a bit of a two-part question, maybe even exploring a sense of shadow for yourself, and then perhaps even just approaching this, what you say is quite clearly underexplored. There's positive psychology, there's all sorts of different things that feel like comfortable realms in a working space. But just what that made this more of an important issue for you to bring to the light, I guess, in a corporate setting as well. So I guess just firstly with yourself.
Yeah, so for me, I mentioned the three areas that really sparked my curiosity on the topic. But I never write, Mark, as an expert. I write as somebody who struggles with the topic. So I wrote not knowing because actually hate not knowing. Like I want to, I struggle with. My therapist said to me, Stephen, you always create polarity where there needs to be none. Do I do this or do I do this? And and then I learned not knowing uncertainty isn't the same as the unknown. It's only one feeling in response to the unknown. So the question became, how do I develop a different relationship with the unknown? Now, the shadow, I talked about this idea of the unconscious impacting our present life. The past is not dead, it's not even past, I think William Faulkner said. And in that way, I could see that why am I doing things that I don't want to do? Why do I derail myself? Why do I self sabotage? And why do I what's the no do gap in my own life, and wrestling with that. And part of it is, and I love the way you said the word redeem, because I think part of it is almost redeeming parts of ourselves that I have shut away, and letting it see the light again, letting it come back into life. So have I owned my own anger? Have I owned my own lust? Have I owned my own humanness, my vulnerability? But not meeting parts of myself with judgment. So, but more with curiosity and compassion, I would say, and kindness. And comes back to your thing about how do we show kindness to others, but we don't necessarily show it to our own selves. We're really many of us are harsh critics to ourselves. So, I've been exploring recently this whole world of internal family systems and this idea that we're composed of parts, and there's a parts of us that we've exiled. We've almost like sent them away, or do we protect ourselves from feeling them? And part of the work is not to reject those part of ourselves, even the critic. They all serve a useful function. They're there to protect us. They're there to do something to help us. But how do we recognize that? How do we thank them for the role they've been playing? And then, look to see how we can moderate or turn down or adjust so they're not operating in our lives unconsciously. So that's part of the journey I've taken, Mark, in being able to be with my own parts, as it were, my own things that I judge about myself, and being able to recognize how does it serve me and how does it value. So, and I think that plays out in so many areas of professional life in the everyday. Give an example. I was coaching an executive from Ghana, and she spoke super quickly. And my tendency would be to tell her to experiment what would happen if you spoke more slowly. And yet I had this like a Yoda mentor who was over me, and he said, Stephen, don't try to change her behavior. Ask her to explore, why does she speak fast? So, how, tell me, can you explore how does it serve? Why do you speak fast? She told me she was the youngest child of 8 children. If she didn't speak fast, there's no way her voice would get heard. So that part of her that speaks fast is obviously served a huge function. Yet in her professional life at this stage, it was more a derailer because I find it hard to understand. So we explored that, but the point was she could accept how that served her, and then she could moderate and not just dismiss something about herself. So I think, when I'm thinking about shadow and I'm thinking about my own shadow, it's a lot about bringing compassion and bringing kindness, because the shadow got formed from rejection, and it can only get healed with that kind of compassion and that kind of acceptance. And the paradox is, the more we can do that with ourselves, the more that we are able to show empathy and kindness with others, particularly those who may, trigger us and we feel some form of judgment, some form of reaction. So that's the work, and I can't pretend to be an expert in this. I've just written the book, so
Yeah. But
it's just a lifelong journey, as we both know. It's not like a weekend course. Life will give many opportunities to trigger and to show what are the parts of myself that I'm rejecting, and how can I bring curiosity rather than defensiveness to that.
just to before you even get to the second part, I just wanted to touch on how significant, though, I think what you're saying is. So, like
Mm.
I think we greatly underappreciate. Like we seem to have this very clear idea of how we're going to fix ourselves, and there's almost this vertical idea, you say, of almost improving ourselves or self actualization. And how little, I think so much of it's predicated on almost delivering an outcome before we could come into acceptance of what we are. So it's
Yes,
almost going through a process where we're judging ourselves right up until the moment that we see something change. But the the impossibility of that is, how can you get to that point? How can you get to a point of acceptance or greater self worth if you're not
yeah,
good enough until you achieve X, Y, or Z? But I
yeah.
think even in
That's
our
the
relationship,
that's the improvement treadmill, isn't it, Mark? That's the self improvement. And in the earlier part of my life, it was about that. It was
yeah,
about the Tony Robbins. It was the technique. It was the change. And then a part of that, I got tired. I'm tired of self improvement. I can't remember. There was an author who wrote a book called "Death and the End of Self Improvement," because
right.
it's like the ultimate end of trying to improve yourself. But there's a time where it comes. Realize that that could be an endless game. Going back to Tony Mello, we mentioned at the beginning. He has a little story, and it's someone saying to him, don't change," and hearing those words, "don't change." And when he said that, I could accept myself, and then I changed. And in Gestalt psychology, there's this paradoxical theory of change by Arnold Beiser. And he says we change by fully inhabiting where we are, not by becoming what we're not. And
Yeah.
I've come to that journey, less about wanting to move away from some, but by fully inhabiting and being aware and conscious of where I am, feeling what I don't want to feel or what I am unable in the past to feel, learning to open, and from that space allows change to happen, not from a place of forceful or berating or shame or anything like this, but from a place of acceptance. And I think that's a powerful journey, and that's a lifelong journey, in terms of self compassion and understanding.
Absolutely, and the joke is, I think, is that we will change naturally if we give ourselves the compassion and the
Yeah,
space to.
yeah,
And I think even just
yes.
the inquiry of curiosity is so powerful in accepting other people too. Like, if we can be
Mm,
curious about the predicament that we find ourselves in, almost, or curious about the human experience, and once again,
mm,
to agree with that sentiment around telling someone not to change, like, there's something
mm,
so powerful. Like, I really do think of love as an acceptance of who someone is in this very moment, almost. And from your experience,
mm,
because I think there's something, and appreciate you saying not an expert at this, but I think living the experience is one of the most powerful things, that when we're looking to help anyone else or to offer even a suggestion of something to anyone else. But there's something
mm,
about living some of the experiences you've pointed to, and then just how stark it could be to look at particular parts of society or even parts of family. It could be a whole series of places. But
Mm.
just really curious from you going through this experience yourself, and then looking at this in the realms of like leadership or with corporates. Like this is it feels quite like when you feel or experience an absence of this process, it can feel quite stark. So and then
Yes.
curious for you then, just even when you were looking at the landscape and seeing how kind of maybe hesitant culturally, regardless of even just corporate culture, we might be about approaching the dark. How did you then turn your attention more towards that setting then?
Yeah. So what I try to do with all the books, Mark, is I try to avoid using the language. This is actually the first book that I mentioned spiritual. In the past, I've not used the word mindfulness. I've not used the word spiritual, because coming back to the point we made earlier, the spiritual and the humanity, I see them as interlinked, and I don't see it as a separate sphere of life as such. But it should be in the immanent and in the everyday experience. But I thought there was a huge value in now reclaiming and naming, particularly, I look at the idea of the shadow life or the shadow career, where around midlife, I turned 50 this year. And part of the midlife experience is, you tend to look back and tend to have a sense of restlessness. And many people have a sense of regret for decisions maybe made early in their career where you might have prioritized, let's say, prestige or security, in the absence of, let's say, another part of your life, and let's say your purpose or creativity or energy. And the question then becomes, how do I reclaim that part of myself, not by reliving the past, but by bringing something forward that honors that original desire. So that was a part of it. Now, for bringing this into corporates, I've tended to look at ways to be a bridge between different disciplines, and not just to look at it through a philosophy lens, but to look at it through poetry, film, through literature, through an everyday leadership and management. So there's nothing to reject. I think that's important, because as soon as we tend to preach from a position, then there's something that is unwelcoming to somebody who doesn't follow our specific view. So I've tried to be inclusive in the approach. And I use a lot of films, let's say Hitman from Netflix, or Perfect Days by Wim Wenders, or Ikaru. So different movies that probably some of them people have seen or can see that they relate to bring it to life. The phrase that I try to bring in all the books actually is this term called negative capability, which you may be aware, or some listeners or viewers. It's a phrase from the poet John Keats, and he wrote a letter to his brothers George and Thomas in 1817. He described negative capability as the ability to be with mystery, uncertainty, and doubt, without irritable reaching after fact and reason. And what he was trying to do there was to help artists, particularly, well, people learn from artists. How do you tolerate the unknown, and how do you, without having to produce like something that's measurable, rational, hold it a bit longer? And for me, negative capabilities are what we don't privilege in the world of work or in society that are useful. So we teach people to speak well, but not necessarily to listen well. We teach activity rather than, let's say, pausing and silence. And what I'm trying to do in the books is to focus on the power of negative capabilities, to almost like bring some sense of balance. Not to say the positive capabilities are wrong, they're useful, but we hold them, but we also make space for what isn't seen and what isn't privileged. And so the shadow is literally that. It's what we don't see that isn't privileged, that can make our lives richer if it was also included. So that's the bringing together really, and that comes back to the sense of wholeness, and it's reclaiming, or in your word, redeeming more of ourselves, so that we can offer more in our lives to our loved ones, to us, and experience more aliveness in our own lives. So that's what I'm trying to do. So the language I'm hoping business takes is the language of negative capabilities, and in a way that they can understand and use. And that's what I've attempted to do in each of the trilogy that I've done.
That's I don't know. I just got the impression while listening to you that was really elegantly expressed. I think, like, I just mean in the sense of not just a theory, but there's a compassion within it of meeting people and acknowledging people where they are, communicating to that place. And I don't mean in a hierarchical sense or a judgmental place of it, but just like a wonderfully aware kind of understanding of where we are, and the description then of the negative capabilities of bringing in these things. I kind of laughed inside at one point because I remember holding a conversation with a leadership team around communication, and it wasn't
Mm.
until it was just an open emergent dialogue, and it wasn't until about 40 minutes in that the only person who hadn't spoken yet suggested listening as a part of communication. So you just had me kind of thinking about that, and just
Yes.
how underappreciated some, I'm sure, some of these
Yeah.
what you define as negative capabilities, how
Yeah.
missing they are. And yes, how how much I don't think it's such a big a leap. There's
Mm.
something about a gentle probing or bringing awareness to, because of course these are just such natural and innate capabilities.
Mm.
As you say, it's not to dismiss everything that we're promoting or putting more weight into. It's more almost like a reminding of the other part that's being forgotten, it seems.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. It shouldn't be like it's called the via negativa, like the negative way. So it's not putting more tools onto our toolbox, but it's rather the law of subtraction, as you're saying, and focusing on what's been missing rather than trying to acquire new skills and making it about achievement again. So hopefully it's silence. Hopefully it shouldn't be an achievement. So I remember going to like a Krishnamurti meditation a school actually in Brockwood Park, and there was a room called the silent room, and it says you don't come here to be silent, you bring silence with you. And I thought that was really like profound, because I'm not trying to take away all noise, because there will be noise somewhere. You're bringing that silence with you and enjoying that silence. And yeah, for me that's exploring negative capabilities is probably what I'm going to be trying to articulate better and trying to bring into the world of work in a more clearer way. But I think there's a beauty there and there's a value there for each of us.
It's interesting you mentioned silence there. That's something I've experimented with a lot, and even ran these
Mm.
experiments called silent conversations, and ran brought that into corporate spaces as well. Thankfully, people have been a little bit lenient in understanding my weirdness or strangeness at times. But for you, just out of curiosity, when did the notion of subtraction become more of a, like, when did that come more into your awareness or your understanding that perhaps there's more of a subtraction required here than adding more tools to the toolbox?
Mm. I think it's just with the acknowledgement that it's hard to say what something is with any accuracy, but it's easier to say what it's not. And I find most explanations always fall down. Like, and they always, there's some other part to them or something that it misses. And so I find myself less satisfied with explanation and adding story, but I find more beauty in subtraction and in not knowing, in the sense that of being able to admit I don't know, but being able to stay with this space and with that mindset. I find that much more attractive to me personally than pretending I know and developing lots of theories. And I think it fits in well with a big influence on me has been Taoism. And it's almost like in Tao, in the Tao, you can't say what it is, but the Tao that can be named is not the Tao type of thing. And I think that's also true for our spiritual lives, but also in terms of our everyday lives. And if we were to really look at it, so we don't know as much as we think we know. And that humility and that understanding allows us to, at least advance ideas, but to retain the humility that, these are just playful expressions, ways of exploring, and to bring that kind of attitude and into what we do. So I'm hoping, I didn't add fun as one of the ways that I live a life, but there's a sense of lightness by, not taking dialogue so seriously and not taking ourselves so seriously, and exploring this with a sense of lightness and is equally important as well. It relates to the last one about aliveness. Aliveness is also celebration. It's also gratitude, but it's also lightness. If something is alive, it has those kind of qualities rather than heavy, rather than serious. So, I think that's there's is it Paul Watzlawick who wrote the situation is critical but not serious. So I think in a spirit of the work we're doing, it's critical, it's important in these times. It's not trivial, but it doesn't need to be heavy. It doesn't need to be serious. There's a sense of lightness. There's a spirit of curiosity, as you said, and being able to be with the negative capability Keats wrote about. And I think they're the vital kind of ingredients or capacities that we can have as leaders.
And not for the first time in this conversation, I just absolutely could have just sat listening to you for much longer with what you were explaining there. I think there's a, as I say, just a beautiful quality, I think, to what you're exploring and the clarity to which you're seeing things. There's something I just wanted to ask. I don't think I've asked someone this before, but how would you say like your felt sense of the relationship? I don't want this to be too abstract because I sense you'll be able to maybe point to something in it. Your felt sense of your experience with the unknown. How have you sensed that kind of evolve in your life?
Yeah, I think when I in the not knowing book we talk about something called the edge and reactions at the edge, and use the metaphor of Finisterre, which is a coastal town which is 90 kilometers from Santiago, and there's a famous pilgrimage called the Camino de Santiago, and travelers used to walk another 90 kilometers to reach the coastal town. And Finisterre in the Latin means the end of the earth or the edge of the end of the earth, Finisterre. And the coastal maps always used to have serpents, dragons, lions, and because cartographers drew them, because it was a terrifying, place, because often the sailors didn't return. And when we're in the space of not knowing, it can feel terrifying. And it's not just a psychological but physiological. We can feel in our tummy, we can have different sensations in our chest, and we looked at different reactions at the edge. From control, taking back control, almost like a sense of resignation. Nothing will happen. A sense of analysis. Let me just bring my spreadsheet or the consultants in catastrophic thinking. The worst will happen, which is my reaction at the end. That I'll miss the plane if I'm an hour late or whatever it happens to be. But catastrophic. I call the 30-second rush to action. Let's do something, anything, to take away the anxiety of staying with the unknown. And then, let's say, resistance, like procrastination. Now, with me, I notice my reaction at the edge is catastrophic thinking. And I tend to think, oh, the worst will happen. And there's a business book called Only the Paranoid Survive, which is true because they're prepared for the worst. But often the worst doesn't happen. And, it's like the Mark Twain's thing around. Most people worry about things that will never happen. But the toll is huge. It's emotional toll, mental toll for companies that are like that. Their staff are always in urgent mode, and they're maybe burned out preparing for things that don't happen. And But there's the benefit and the cost. So there's always a benefit. You're prepared, but the cost is you might spend hours, weeks, months worrying or preparing for things that don't happen. Same with the rush to action. Leaders have a bias for action. It's good we learn as we move forward, but it may be a quick fix and not solve the real problem. So what I've learned is to pay more attention to when I'm in the state of not knowing and what is my default reaction, and then just to pause, and at least I can act a bit more consciously rather than just default doing it, playing out my reaction at the edge. And I think that's useful as an individual, but that's also useful as leaders to know what impact you have on your team when you're at the edge. But also, organizations have cultures of how they behave at the edge. Some are very much calling analysis, some are tighten down the controls, some are let's move forward. And being conscious of that allows a bit more choice. So that's my own experience, Mark, being more attentive. What is my reaction? But hands up, mine is catastrophic thinking. Yeah.
But I think that there's even if that's the realization, I think that there's something beautiful about those pauses, even at the edge or the moments of
Mm.
reflection. And I'm not saying that I perpetually live in a state of peace with the uncertain as the unknown, but there's definitely just different ways, or even the when our awareness increases, like subtleties of awareness of our response, even if catastrophic were the headline or something, even just the different pulses within that, I think are which are possible from what you're approaching or from what you're suggesting you're doing at the edge at this point. Stephen, just looking at what we've even opening up with, very much the question of what is a good life for you is something that's remained present. Initially thinking it could be through a sense of vocation, but realizing even through the priesthood, if it wasn't for you, the significance of things like, meaning, contribution, community, but very much this sense of aliveness as well. And, you know, acknowledging that though that sense of aliveness, it isn't just all the sunshine and the light, it's everything. And that bringing you into the sense of, this exploring more the shadow, your own personal inquiry into that, a curiosity from that into what we do in the workspace too, this looking at shadow and this beautiful lens through the psychological, the biological, culture, and then spirituality as well. This lovely idea of, whether I say redeeming, but just this component of not looking or not being afraid to go to the places that so many people seem afraid to go, and particularly, let's say, even within corporate culture. But this beautiful idea then of, exploring have a willingness to explore the unknown. Um, Tying on from what John Keats said about negative capabilities, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's about, like, how do we develop or acknowledge these negative capabilities that have such significant impact or potential impact as well that maybe we're not presently engaging with. Um, all through it, though, this beautiful, I think, inquiry or thoughtfulness, of never seeming being too rigid. Like, even, okay, my religion isn't maybe the way I'm going to absolutely do it, but it's a foundation as well. So there's this lovely piece of, even, I think, even your present understandings redeeming parts, and it's not a case of casting anything away,
Mm.
but, as you say, a movement towards wholeness. Really curious, Stephen, to ask you the question of, what is a good life for you?
Mm. Now, I didn't prepare for this, Matt, but what I think
Perfect.
now is based on our conversation, a good life is a kind life. And by kind, I mean kinder to ourselves, kinder to others, and kinder to nature and the environment around more broadly. So I would say for me, the theme in our conversation has been around that sense of acceptance, or that sense of the heart of that, I think, is the word kindness. So I think if we can learn to be a bit more kinder, a bit more compassionate to ourselves, to others, that's the good life. So yeah. That's my answer.
I've been having a number of these conversations recently, and as complex as we think the world's problems are, there's something so kind of, and I don't doubt that they're complex in different ways. I don't doubt that human beings are complex characters in many cases, but there's also a wonderful welcoming invitation to back to simplicity, I think, and maybe even subtraction. And at
Mm.
the core of that, I definitely agree, is a sense of kindness or acceptance. And I'm so grateful for you joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.